down my block and now the cops are stopping me. I said, what you doing here? Like, why you trying to talk to me? I said, officer, what am I doing wrong? Let me get just what I came for, I really won't be long. When I told him I had children, he was looking at me differently. Doing what I'm doing, why he gotta clench his fist at me. I came about the dirt, but they still mad cause of my history. I'ma keep on going to the top until they sick of me. Steady protest, but I don't even see a change. Always hearing BLM, but is it really in your brain? Gotta see what's going on, cause we ain't all treated the same. Why so serious? I'm furious, cause this is not no game.
I want to welcome you back to NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. I want to welcome my co-hosts, Matthew Martin and Dr. Timothy Christie. And before we get into the show, I want to emphasize the action piece of New Brunswickers Want Action. That's the purpose of this show. We're going to be bringing forward some very good content, some very important information, but we're not here just to ramble on and on and on and talk about how terrible systemic discrimination is. The purpose of this show is to create action and outcomes related thereto. So as we move into this, I want you to understand, today we're going to be talking about 3 specific topics and the outcomes which are desired at the end. So we're going to talk about Joyce Echaquan, the unfortunate death of Miss Echaquan in a Quebec hospital. She was an Indigenous woman from Quebec. We're going to talk about the unfortunate circumstances which are occurring in Nova Scotia right now with the Mi'kmaq fishers and the systemic discrimination they're experiencing when it comes to their right to fish. And then we're going to bring it home here in New Brunswick, and we'll discuss the death of Chantal and we'll discuss the death of Rodney Levi. All very important topics, but again, in this preamble, I want to emphasize action. We're not here to spend the next several episodes or any of our episodes talking. We're sharing information so that we can actually realize outcomes and action. So, Matthew, let's start with you today. Do you want to lead into the opening of our episode today?
Yeah, so I want to kick off and talk about Joyce Echaquan in Quebec.
Yeah.
She unfortunately is no longer with us, but I think we need to discuss and take a look at what happened while she was in the hospital.
Sure.
On Facebook Live, she had streamed the agony and pain she was in, and at the same time, a nurse and an orderly in that hospital was hurling insults at her, telling her she'd probably be better off dead, that she was stupid. And I think taking a look at it, you know, we're seeing some clear signs that there's an issue in our medical field and in the medical system.
Right.
You know, since then, the nurse and the orderly have been fired. It resulted a meeting that took place over the last couple of days, or yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, where over 400 different members within a whole slew of fields got together to discuss the systemic racism that is happening in the medical field.
And the Premier of Quebec disavows the existence of systemic discrimination in Quebec. How can that be?
Oh, I don't even think that, like, at this point, it's not even something that I think is a surprise. I think we've seen in Campbellton, the mayor brushed off as it's just a thing of fear. I think now it's becoming a common trait among...
Well, I think this is the 4th time in a couple of months where we've heard a person in a political position say systemic discrimination does not exist in their world. Mm-hmm. Tim, your thoughts on that?
Well, it's the same frustration we've had forever. Fortunately, in these days of cell phones, immediate video coverage, access to Facebook, YouTube, and that type of instant recording of reality as it's happening in real time, mm-hmm. It's a very poignant, clear example of the things that have been happening for years. Mm-hmm. For generations, for decades, this has been happening to Indigenous people, to Black people, to a whole bunch of racial minorities and ethnic minorities, mm-hmm. but it hasn't been filmed. Now we have the opportunity to film it as it's happening, and this is forcing some people for whom it was invisible before. So systemic discrimination might have been invisible to many, 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 many people. Mm-hmm. But now they're saying, boy, is that really happening? I can't believe it. And it's not that it's a new phenomena. It's mm-hmm. not that it's new. It's that it's just hasn't been recorded before.
That's right.
Now the Premier, I think he's still in these days before recordings where he was trying to say, well, the Premier of Quebec, that is, where he's trying to disavow the existence of it. And I don't think that you can define something out of existence.
Well,
reality is independent of our beliefs.
I've said this in one of our shows before. The reality is there's a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there's a Human Rights Act, there are provincial acts everywhere. I'm not suggesting that they are, they meet the need that they exist for, but one of those needs is systemic discrimination and dealing with that. So how can they have a Human Rights Act in that province and him say systemic discrimination doesn't exist, but that's why you have the Human Rights Act for the most part? It's just not even logical. The reasoning doesn't work for me, clearly, right?
And I think, like I said, it's invisible to him.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make him racist, doesn't make him insensitive, it just makes him ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
And some people can only learn through their own experiences. They can't learn through the experience of others.
Exactly.
And Aristotle would say they're probably the least wise people in our society and probably the last person you want leading a province.
Mm-hmm. And it's exhausting to have to tell stories, a different story every day, or even in our situation every episode, because we're not about the stories. Those things that have occurred to us are obvious to us, but we're looking for the understanding. But why do we have to keep telling the stories?
Look, you're absolutely right. If I did a little video for a local high school recently,
Mm-hmm.
where I talked about some things that came out of my childhood,
Mm-hmm.
and people watching the video were shocked. But I said, well, the people that are shocked are not the ones who live it. If you take 100 black guys and you tell them there was racism in Moncton public schools in 1970s and 80s, they'd say, uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a surprise to any of us that live it. Those of us that live this on a daily basis, it's a surprise to people for whom like I said, it's invisible.
Mm-hmm. Again, my point was we don't want to tell these stories, but it's kind of necessary for perspective. When my oldest son was born in Halifax, in the hospital, the doctor observed my wife, at the time, my partner and I celebrating the birth of our first son. And one of the first things that was asked of me while my son was still covered in his own fluids was, there are other options. You can put your son up for adoption. And later that day, social services came in to investigate my ex and I, or my former partner and I, because it was a white woman and a black man and a mixed race child. Social services said, I don't know why I'm here. They said there would be concern with this family. At the time, I was a law school student. My former was an engineering student, and we were going to be in a long-term relationship. So that was a bias assessment by the doctor.
Mm-hmm. And was there any repercussions to the doctor, or did he or she get to do that with impunity?
They got to do that with impunity.
This is the
and
problem.
there was nothing to be said.
This is the problem.
Yeah.
Example after example after example, where we say to the victims, you behave yourself, you suck it up, you take it, you live with it. But the perpetrators get to keep their jobs as doctors, as lawyers, as professors. They get to keep their jobs in these powerful positions. And we have an organization like Social Development, in your example, saying, I don't even know what I'm here for. Well, if people are making false calls to you based on racist motivations, do something about it.
Well, and again, I know that the person I spoke to, they knew what was happening there, right? It was clear, and they didn't do anything. And is that an issue that they were disempowered, or they're just like, okay, this isn't something I want to stick my hands in, or this is normal, right? And I would believe at that time in Halifax that would have been considered normal relative to their race relations in that province, right? Matthew, you got any more comment on that?
No, I think at the grand scheme of things, we can easily say that the medical system in Quebec has an issue with systemic racism.
The medical system in Canada.
In Canada.
I mean, Tim can give us an example possibly out of Vancouver. I'm giving you examples in New Brunswick. The news is giving us examples out of Quebec. Yeah. I've given you an example out of Nova Scotia. And this is just a small room of 3 men who can give you examples all day long. So what's happening across the country?
And I think
thoughts only.
As Tim said, we're in such a video age. This is video proof now of there's this problem. Here's the video for you to see it. And I mean, we're seeing videos pop up right now all across Atlantic Canada.
Okay. Notwithstanding, healthcare affects us all, and we need to have equality of treatment and equality of ethical treatment in healthcare. Let's talk about what's going on in Nova Scotia right now. It's national, international news. What I've observed in the news has disturbed me, but let's talk about this tension, the fight for equality that the Mi'kmaq are experiencing such pushback in when it comes to their ability to have a subsistence fishery, which allows them to actually make some money and eat. Let's talk about that pushback that they're experiencing and the violence they're experiencing from the white fishers.
I want to, before we move forward with that, I just want to correct you because you said, in their fight for equality. I don't think it's a fight for their equality. I think it's a fight to be able to do what their charter rights are.
Well, exactly. They're attempting to exercise their rights under the Treaty of 1760 to fish, quite frankly. Right, I agree.
And I think it's a fair enough point. I don't think that we have to get into a discussion about treaty rights.
Right.
That's not what our show is about. Our show is about racism.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to say to those white fishers that no matter how justified you think you are, no matter how right you think you are, your actions are inexcusable. You are not justified. You are not legally, ethically, morally, or any other sense justified in doing what you're doing. So you might think you're right, you might think you're correct, but the racist vitriol, the violence that you're imposing on these people for doing what they're doing, whether you're right or wrong, you have no right to do this to anyone else.
To anyone, for any reason.
Exactly.
You can't break the law trying to enforce what you think should be the law.
Exactly.
Right.
So their behavior is simply inexcusable no matter why they think they're justified in doing it. And on one of our previous episodes, we talked about how white people tolerate ethnic minorities in their communities. And one of the things that I said was, we're kind of being held there by a thread. And as soon as something happens to disturb that thread or cut that thread, they will come down on us like a ton of bricks. So these people in Nova Scotia are part of that community. They put out a few nets, and what I heard was there's maybe 350 lobster traps out there or so. It wasn't thousands and thousands, apparently. And a mob of several hundred people came to where their traps were stored that had lobster in it, and they attacked those people. They attacked the building, they took the lobster nets, they killed the lobsters. There was RCMP officers there. On the video I saw, I counted seven RCMP officers. And the RCMP officers took the Indigenous people, so the people who were the victims of this violent hate crime, racially motivated crime, and said to them, you stand there quietly and you behave yourself and you let this mob do whatever they're going to do.
Because we're here to protect you.
Because we're here to protect you, and that's what they said.
Respectfully, again, the RCMP being one of our long-standing institutions, whom I've, for the most part, felt comfortable with an RCMP officer versus any local municipal officer in my past. Having said that, what I observed there was exactly as you said, Tim. You stand there, we're here to protect you as they steal your livelihood, destroy your possessions, and basically take away your right to live, in my opinion.
That's right. And I want to talk about that because I've been at dinners, I've been out socializing, I've been talking to people, and some people say, what do you expect 7 RCMP officers to do to a crowd of 200 or 300? And that's a fair enough question, and I think we should take it seriously. But I think that everybody can agree we need better than what these guys did. These people stood there, these RCMP officers literally stood there with their hands in their pockets, their heads down, and they looked at the victims of these racially motivated hate crimes and said, you just stand there quietly and behave yourself, and then things won't escalate. But if you go near them, if you go out there, if you try to protect your own property, you're the one that's going to escalate things. Now, sorry, but if you call 911 and the RCMP come, maybe it should be with a preface. We will come, but if you're Indigenous and there's not enough of us and there's more of them, we might not be able to do anything to help you. So then our mandate is just going to be towards you behaving yourself, not us protecting you.
I don't think that I'm being exaggerative when I say this, but had those tables been turned and it was the Mi'kmaq fishers that were gathering en masse to protest the white fishers, I'm pretty certain somebody would have been arrested and that group would have been put down very quickly because, and I only say that based on my historical observations of how Indigenous folks are treated when trying to express their rights.
And I think we should be careful, though, with thought experiments and analogies. They are a thought experiment or analogy. I don't think that the Mi'kmaq people would behave that way.
Nor do I.
Right? So it's not that it's a realistic alternative that the tables would be turned.
Agreed.
Right?
Agreed.
So the reality is this is the entitlement that white people in our society think they have. If ethnic minorities anger them enough, if they provoke them enough, if they do something that the white community in there feels offensive enough, they will, with all the self-righteous indignation they can muster, come and, for lack of a better word, do nothing but a 21st century lynching on you.
Yeah, and I believe that's what we have observed with Ms. Echaquan and what's gone on here in Publico in the area is exactly that. Notwithstanding, allegedly no one's been hurt, although there is one person who was hurt in the most recent fire, whom allegedly was involved in starting the fire. I look at this situation in Nova Scotia, and again, we talked about it this morning, it's just a righteous indignation, and for me, it's a righteous indignation of what the law is, and respect for that law, and I'm not going to get into all that, but the rights are there, they exist. The law protects, just like every person, the Mi'kmaq from, I don't know, threat of violence, threat of death, actual violence, and I believe that those 7 officers, notwithstanding the number of officers and the number of protesters, had an obligation to do something, and it wasn't to stand between the Mi'kmaq and their catch while the other fishers took it and destroyed it.
Yeah. It's in the video that you're speaking about, Tim. I watched it from start to beginning. In the video, you see as they're trying to go from their parked vehicle into the facility, at one point they're standing behind an officer, and the officer was more worried about these 3 individuals standing behind them, and said,
"Oh yes, I saw that.
Don't stand behind me. I don't like people standing behind me." Well, they're trying to get to where they're.
And then there's 200 people in front of him.
Rioting.
Protesting and rioting and being
Absolutely.
violent. It didn't make any sense to me either.
And when you continue to watch the video, at one point the mob, I would say, was at least 10 feet away from the traps, and the individual in the video says, "Just go stand in front of the traps instead of standing in front of us, and let us take what's ours, and shut our doors." And the officers, "Oh, we can't do that. We can't do that." Absolutely you can. What's the difference between standing in front of these traps that are still
I made
there?
a similar comment to Tim. I said, I think the RCMP, unfortunately, were standing on the wrong side of the traps. They could have diffused the whole situation just by standing on the other side of the traps.
Yep.
Well, I think the point, and you mentioned it earlier, is that we have laws written on paper that say that they're supposed to protect our Indigenous brothers and sisters.
That's right.
And that's just laws written on paper.
It is.
The reality of the people working in the system is, in that circumstance, they did not adequately protect our Indigenous brothers and sisters.
Agreed.
They'll give us 1,000 reasons for why they couldn't do it. And I would have to say, talk is cheap. Your actions speak louder than words.
And again, I emphasize, we've got ministers from the highest level of government saying, hey, yes, systemic discrimination exists in this country in many different areas, but yet at the ground level, we've got provincial governments denying the existence of it. So how do we move forward? How do we, besides provide the information and ask for action, how do we get our outcomes if those in power are not even believing that there should be an outcome because our crisis does not exist? It's really a challenge for me. Any further comments on that? Because again, it's an ongoing situation that'll be ongoing, I believe, for some time. But the outcome, I believe, that would be righteous and legal would be that those folks would be allowed to continue their subsistence fishery, and that the police and the justice system would handle those protesters and rioters
Well, you know what, man?
in an appropriate way.
With the amount of video evidence we have of what happened,
I know.
those RCMP officers had better be conducting investigations and arresting people.
Yeah.
And if they are not, they should be fired from their jobs.
Yep. I agree.
I can identify the people from the videos I've seen, and I'm not even a trained professional criminal investigator.
Yep.
So if we can do it, there's so much evidence of what happened, they'd better get their asses in gear and do something useful.
And that would be an appropriate outcome, that a full investigation take place to the actions of these individuals
Hoodlums.
who were violent and hoodlums. Yeah, they really were hoodlums. It's like, I'm going to come to your house and open your fridge and take all your stuff out and nobody can do anything. That's a simple example, but it was really that, it was that simple for them.
Right.
It really was disgusting. Now, moving forward, now all of this to say is to provide examples of long-standing and overall systemic discrimination in our public service, in our government services, in our justice system, etc. And we've got two examples bringing it back to New Brunswick that I think we need to really discuss because of the outcomes to, unfortunately, dead Indigenous members, and how that happened. So we're going to talk a little bit, if you guys don't mind, about Rodney Levi and Chantal Moore. Okay, so Chantal Moore and Rodney were both, in my opinion, the victims of systemic discrimination, the outcome being their death while being reviewed, investigated, visited for wellness visits based on their interactions with social development and mental health, etc. Many departments within our government. Tim, I'm going to focus that question on you. And what the hell went wrong here? Pardon my language.
Well, so the facts are Chantal Moore, the late Chantal Moore, I'm sorry. She was living in Edmundston, and someone called the police and said, I'm concerned about her mental health, so will you conduct a wellness check? So the police went to her where she lived, and an altercation happened, and they shot and killed her. So she died. She was shot and killed because she was exhibiting the symptoms of her disease, which was a mental illness.
And I'll correct myself. Rodney Levi was not killed in a wellness check.
That's correct. That's correct. Rodney Levi, the police were called on him because of an unwanted person at a barbecue. So they went, and apparently, or allegedly, he was struggling with some form of a problematic substance use disorder. And because of the symptoms of that disorder, he was behaving in a certain way. The police once again found that this behavior was so threatening that they had to use lethal force, so he was shot and killed.
That's interesting. I didn't see the police kill anybody in Nova Scotia last week. They didn't feel threatened at all, I guess. They didn't even pull out their guns.
That is
300 protesters, violent protesters.
Look, racism is a fundamentally irrational behavior. So we can't expect racists to be consistently racist.
Right, or
They can
consistently rational in their racism.
They can be arbitrary and irrational. So if we look at Chantal Moore and
unfortunate death.
And Mr. Levi, they had many, many, many interactions with different government departments. So for instance, if you need a mental health wellness check, that means you're involved with Department of Health and probably mental health services. You could be involved with social services as well. Who knows how many government departments she's involved with.
Exactly.
Levi, with a problematic substance use disorder, allegedly, well, that would be addiction services, Department of Health as well. And now they also have an interaction with the RCMP in one case and Edmundston Police in the other case. More government departments. So you have all these interactions with all of these government departments, and the outcome for you is to be shot and killed. I would say that means if I'm interacting with government departments and the outcome results in me being shot and killed, there's a problem. The systems are not working for those people that are ending up being shot and killed.
Well, I believe at least one of those contexts, their involvement with all of these departments is to avoid interaction with the criminal justice system. Isn't that the outcome that we're looking for? Besides,
or to get better.
To get better.
Right.
But I mean, my thoughts only. When you have folks that are dealing with mental issues and drug abuse issues, at least in our community, I've observed that they often have interactions with the police, right, related to their issues. And my thoughts are, at least being a lawyer and interacting with a lot of the departments that you just mentioned, is we focus people in those areas to get help so that they don't end up in criminal court with me or interacting with the police. So clearly that's not working. And I don't believe you can point at the individual only.
Well, these people didn't get to end up in court. They ended up dead.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So an analogy, an example of where the system responded rationally. So where our public systems did a good job, I think, happened in the 1990s. And there were two young children that were killed, John Ryan Turner and Jessica Brewer. And Jessica was like 28 months and John Ryan was 3 years old. And they died of malnutrition and dehydration, which was from abuse and neglect from their parents. Now, each of these children were receiving multiple government services from multiple different departments. So at the end of it, people in charge of government said, how can so many different government departments be involved in providing services to these children and the children end up dead? They said, this means there's a problem with our system and we need to fix it. So they convened what was called the Child Death Review Committee. And the Child Death Review Committees were mandated with reviewing everybody that these kids were involved with and figuring out what went wrong in the system to result in that outcome. Because once again, every system is perfectly designed to get the outcome it gets. And they said, this is not an acceptable outcome. We need to change it. I would submit to you that the shootings that happened here in New Brunswick, there are systems designed to get that outcome. And rational people should do the same we did in the 90s and say, we need to fix our system. This is not an acceptable outcome of our system.
Matthew, Tim, I want to thank you both for being on the show again today. We're going to wrap up today, but I believe what we're all agreeing to here is that the province needs a whole of government approach when it comes to a public inquiry investigating the existence and the effects, because we already know it exists, of systemic discrimination on Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks in New Brunswick. Is that where we're all going here?
Absolutely.
So you've heard it, folks, here on NBWA. We've talked about Quebec, the unfortunate death of Miss Echaquan. We've talked about the fishers, the Mi'kmaq fishers in Nova Scotia, and the fact that they're being attacked on a daily basis. And we've talked about the death, unfortunately, of Rodney, Levi, and Chantal here in New Brunswick. But all we're talking about is systemic discrimination and its obvious existence. And we're calling for you, our leaders, to publicly investigate this so that we can have an outcome and some change. New Brunswickers want action. You heard? Make it a great day, folks, and I want to welcome you folks for being here.